Hello, I'm going to give you a talk about Colchester's sewers, brewers and hooers. Yep, that's the title. It's a talk in 3 parts, but with a common theme. So, an explanation. Well, one day in 2013, a lady named Annie came to me and said, "I want you to do a talk for my man Mike." Knowing my keen interest in Colchester history, she told me that the subject was to be sewers, brewers and hooers. She had a twinkle in her eye, and I rose to the challenge. The talk was written and then given to the intended audience, and was later to be repeated to other audiences. The talk's title was catching the eye of other groups and organisations who also asked to hear the talk, so, okay, there was a hint of salacious content, and probably most wanted to get to the last bit. So I ask you, give it a chance, please. I understand the attraction of the last bit, but the middle bit is good too, as well as the first bit. As with my other talks, despite the seemingly dull but perhaps suggestive title of this one, it covers 3 important areas of Colchester's amazing history, not dealt with in any detail by my other talks. Sadly, Mike Powell is no longer with us, and he never did hear this talk. He and I and a few others were founder members of the Colchester Town Watch, which developed and became the civic bodyguard to the Mayor of Colchester. Mike is the big lad in this picture, 5th from the left. I'm there somewhere too. We chose the clothing and accessories from the Elizabethan era around 1595 and set ourselves up as a historical reenactment group. With sponsorship from the Colchester Gazette, we were able to buy essential items and get the clothing made. That was back in 2001. As I speak, I'm proud to say that the watch is still going strong. This is for you, Mike. Also for the other 3 that have also gone ahead: Mike Simpson, Trevor Deeprose and Phil Manchester. It was great fun and a delight to know you all. Sewers are the inevitable product of a civilised society. Man, living in a small community, would set aside an area where the people of his settlement could go to urinate and to defecate, perhaps to contemplate. A place close to his settlement, but far enough away not to disturb the people of the settlement by the smell or the outfall. Archaeologists love to find these places, middens, latrines, call them what you will, for it is there that they can discover so much about the lives of our ancestors. Poo tells the story. Then along came the Romans invading Britannia in AD 43. With them came engineers and urban planners who set about the task of creating places where large numbers of people could live together in a civilised manner. To the Romans, that included a need for sanitation, sewers and all that, just like they'd done back home in Rome. And so it was that Colchester entered the civilised world and gained its first sewers. This picture shows some of our almost 2,000-year-old sewerage outlets in our Roman wall, and others that are open to inspection in the castle park. They are all small tunnels that are, or rather were, large enough to enable a small person to get into to clean them, but not large enough for a big, hairy, tooled-up attacker to be easily able to negotiate. This plan was created by the Colchester Archaeological Trust and shows how the Roman Colonia, later to be known as Colchester, was laid out around the year 300. It shows at least 8 drains in the outer perimeter wall 3 of which are clearly visible today. There were probably more. It also shows other drains that were hidden below ground, but which were fed by specific areas within the Colonia. Duncan's Gate, for instance, has some very interesting sewer tunnels that lead up the hill towards the Temple of Claudius and where Colchester's castle stands today. Around the perimeter wall, the Romans added a vallum, a defensive ditch that added height to the height of the walls and into which the sewerage would have drained, a kind of smelly moat that would have added to the undesirability of external attack. Of course, with paved streets and many buildings, rainwater could not simply soak into the ground and disappear, and with so many people living in the Colonia at any one time, perhaps 5,000 people, their natural bodily functions also required a means to get rid of waste. Surface drains and underground sewers were the obvious way to do it, all draining away from the centre of the Colonia and out through the drain outlets that we see here. As the Monty Python team gave us in their Life of Brian, what have the Romans ever done for us? The several answers in response being the aqueduct, sanitation, roads, irrigation, medicine, education, wine, public baths. It was safe to walk on the streets at night, law and order, and lastly, they brought peace. The Colonia was built on a hillside, initially as a fortress, not a town. It had no water supply other than by rainwater collection. There were freshwater springs at the foot of the hills, later to be exploited by brewers of beer, but none in the centre of the Colonia. Sadly, we do not have any further evidence of how this worked, but the Romans were very resourceful people, and of course the Colonia thrived. Sewers, a timeline. As previously mentioned, the Romans arrived in 43 and started to build a Colonia, a place where retired Roman soldiers could live and be relied upon to serve Rome's interests. By 410, all was not well with the Roman Empire, and the Colonia was abandoned by the Romans, with civilized life coming to an end, and the Dark Ages began. The Colonia decayed and was uninhabited for several centuries, other than sporadically by small numbers of people, the Danes for a period, and in 1066 the Normans arrived and took over, by which time all that was of any use to the Normans was the rubble from Roman buildings that they were able to use to build Norman Colchester. Buildings such as the castle, churches, etc. However, the Roman system of sewers had by then collapsed, silted up, and been forgotten about. Records started to be kept during the medieval periods, and it was clear the new occupants of the town were not too fond of sanitation in the way that the Romans were. We still see today the sewage outfalls built into the castle's walls, where human waste would pile up on the ground outside to be collected and taken away, probably to be spread on the fields as manure, together with the waste from the townsfolk and animals. Many fines were issued to people that allowed this waste to build up in the public streets. These 3 maps show how the town grew in its population. The earliest is from a John Speed map of 1610, through to a Coleman map of 200 years later, followed by an Ordnance Survey one from the 1890s. The number of houses in the last map shows a considerable increase in housing density and spread, with what would have been a commensurate increased need for sanitation. It wasn't until 1884 that the sewerage works at the Hythe were completed, our Victorian forefathers being finally able to address the health implications that threatened the health of the 30,000 or so inhabitants of the town, that including the garrison inhabitants by that time. This is compared with 11,520 inhabitants in the census year of 1801. It was an explosion boom that brought the real need for coping with sewerage in a new and modern way. So, as I close this section of the talk concerning sewers, let's look at a few dates and happenings. In the early 19th century, the council were not obliged to provide drainage or sewerage from private houses. In 1822, following complaints from householders, they ordered the construction of a 255-foot barrel drain to carry sewage and excess water into the sewer at the entrance of Castle Inn Yard. In the 1830s, cholera morbus was spreading from the Far East and was of great concern in Britain. In 1834, a cholera epidemic elsewhere, not in Colchester, but prompted an investigation which found a positive correlation between neglected drains and the incidence of disease. Dung heaps were an added nuisance, but of course they provided a living for some people. In 1847, a committee to inquire into the sanitary condition of the town reported that the south side remained very filthy and noxious from defective drainage. Between 1847 and 1854, they constructed a network of sewers and drains in the central area, and reaching as far as the Harwich Road, Grinstead Road, Military Road, Malden Road. By 1871, only 1 house in 10 in Colchester had water closets, WCs, and many of those drained into cesspits, not sewers. Between 1835 and 1911, the number of houses in Colchester went from 3,292 to 9,218. In 1835, most houses were within the walls of the town. Open sewers were drained into open ditches. People used cesspits for sewage. Disease in the form of cholera and typhus was caused by the contamination of drinking water and sewage, although cholera did not break out in Colchester. 1857, reports of cholera outbreaks all over the country, especially in places like Newcastle, where 1,474 deaths were reported in one outbreak alone. Colchester was spared a major epidemic. In 1875, the Public Health Act made borough councils into local sanitary authorities with clearly defined statutory duties, and led the council to investigate possible sewerage schemes. By 1880, members of the council had agreed to buy land at the Hythe from the coal merchant Thomas Moy to build a sewage works, which was, as we mentioned earlier, opened in 1884. By the 1930s, work had begun on an important scheme to improve sewerage in the south of the borough, but it had to be abandoned during the Second World War. By 1971, major extensions to the sewage treatment works at the Hythe were opened in 1971, and then by 1974 the plant was taken over by the Anglian Water Authority. In the decades that followed, thousands more houses have been built in Colchester. The Middlewick Ranges, so beloved of people of the town, are currently destined to have another 1,000 or so houses built there. The town's population was estimated to be, in 2018, nearly 200,000 residents, making it the largest of the districts in Essex by population. Even so, it's anticipated that there will be 18,800 new homes built in Colchester by 2023. Those that live and work in the Hythe area of the town will certainly never be rid of what is known as the Hythe Pong. The sewerage works, originally built for 30,000, will soon be catering for 200,000. Sorry folks, the Pong is here to stay.
Alright, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us? Brought peace?
Leaving the Hythe Pong to the people that buy houses ever closer to it and who then complain bitterly about it afterwards, let's turn our attention to a far more enjoyable subject. I hope you will agree. Our sewers are there for our health, but what of our brewers? And so we end this part of our talk, this three-part talk about sewers, brewers and hooers of Colchester. To find out about the second part, the brewers of Colchester, please search where you found this one. You should also find Colchester Brewers Part 2.